Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. Plato wrote, according to him, Socrates asked the following question. It is not a trivial question. What we are discussing is how one should live. And that, I suppose, is the starting point of any inquiry into well-being. Notice it's not saying what makes you feel good, it's asking how one should live. And the question, there are two aspects of the question which are important. One is that it expects a general answer. It's not how you should live, how one should live. And that one is a generalized person. And the second feature of the question is the fact that it expects you to engage with the question yourself. So it's not a question of somebody telling you how you should live. It's for you to engage in that discussion and come to some conclusion. Now, in some sense, it is this question which has been pervasive in ethics as well as in welfare economics, although they appear in different guises, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. In our more democratic age, we bypass an entire history of the Socratic question, which went through various rounds, for example, through Kant, which with his categorical imperative, what is the moral duty of an individual? Notice that's not necessarily implied by Socrates' question. Indeed, the classical Greeks had a very different conception of how one should live, one of them being the feature that influenced Aristotle's writings, had a lot to do with the fact that what makes for a flourishing life, that is, the end product of how one should live, the aim being to have a flourishing life, is activities. Friendship, for example, was a very major ingredient in the Aristotelian conception. But it's activities. We have in economics the expression learning by doing. That's Aristotelian. You, in some ways, discover what the good life is for yourself, how you should live. So it's an engagement with life and the activities you undertake. Now, in our democratic societies, we believe that one way of teasing out how somebody has a conception of how one should live by relying on that person to discover it herself or himself. And by activities, we mean the ingredients that are required to generate the activities which that are useful for us, that allow us to lead a flourishing life. Now, of course, activities are multidimensional, but the idea behind the economist's view on well-being is the fact that no matter what the activity is, you need resources. You need goods and services of some kind. It could be a machine, it could be a table, chair, it could be education, and many other things besides, and I'll come back to the missing item in a few minutes. So when the economist models a person's well-being in terms of consumption, that's how you should read it. We, of course, vulgarize it by regarding it as a scalar very often, or a vector of consumption goods. But the idea is no matter what you do, you need goods. And if you're an Aristotelian and you think in terms of activities, at the end of the day, you end up with the conception of consumption, which is the essential ingredient for the flourishing life. And of course, Aristotle didn't have in mind fashionable clothes. He had something much deeper. But the conception is what we are carrying with us, not its manifestation. All right? So I'm trying to argue as to why the economist's move of thinking of a flourishing life as dependent on consumption is not exactly a crass idea. There is an idealist picture here. In recent years, there's been an empirical attempt, an attempt at empirically determining what makes for a good life. And a natural democratic question would be to ask people, well, what's life for you? How do you assess it? How do you value it? How do you rank it? How do you rate it? And there is a large literature now, empirical literature. Annually, there are these questionnaires that go around throughout the world. You might think these questions are hard to decipher across different cultures, but apparently, so I'm told, the questionnaires don't find much difficulty in people to understand what they mean by asking, how is life going for you? Are you satisfied, not so satisfied, dissatisfied? Or sometimes you ask the question in terms of rating it on a scale of 0 to 10. How do you rate your life? Not how do you feel this minute, necessarily. I'm talking about life satisfaction. Now, notice how I've moved away from Socratic question to something which you can generate through questions to an assessment of life satisfaction. There's been now a huge amount of work on this, and the idea behind the research agenda was to see statistically what are the ingredients that make for life satisfaction. What are the factors? So it's almost as though you're manufacturing satisfaction out of activities, which is, of course, the Aristotelian viewpoint, so it's not a very crass idea. Well, it turns out that income, in particular relative income, matters. Now, relative income, of course, takes us straight into a sociological picture. We care about not only our income, of course, income allows us to do things, and so we are back into the Aristotelian mode. So income is a means. On the other hand, my income versus somebody who has a higher income has an effect on myself, because I might think he or she enjoys things or can do things which I'm unable to do. I don't get as much pleasure out of the fact that I may have more income than somebody below me, as much as a dissatisfaction that I have less than somebody above me. And that too has been noted. So that's been one finding. And the relative income, the fact that relative income matters, is a big breakthrough in customary economic reasoning, where we don't really embed the individual in society. And that's been a major weakness. But it's not something that can be, that cannot be fixed. In my own writings, I've been increasingly using relative income, and then you get to generate very interesting results. So that's one. What are the others? Sense of freedom, employment, again Aristotelian. Employment means you're engaging in work, which often is communal. You're in a factory, office, or whatever, and that part of it comes through. Personal relationships matter. So you regress these features against life satisfaction score 0 to 10, and then see how these components, are they negligible or are they substantial? And there are quite a number of others, depending on the question. You get a variety of things, but the interesting thing is that the ingredients of what makes for life satisfaction are not hard to appreciate or understand. We all have an intuitive sense of why relationships matter, why an isolated life is not one which is going to be very flourishing. And one reason is that, of course, we experience it ourselves. So in some sense, the empirical research, which has now quite mature, reflects our own experiences, and that's one reason we tend to believe it. Now, interestingly, I'm going to now concentrate on one ingredient which is missing in everything I've said here: Mother Nature. And two roots one can discern in the way nature comes into economic reasoning, and I want to pursue both in the remainder of my talk. It turns out that nature does matter, even in these questionnaires. It's just that previously they didn't regard it as part of the ingredient, but now they do. But prior to this literature, nature did enter into economic reasoning. There is a whole class, branch of economics called environmental and resource economics, which is concerned with nature. And by nature, I'm using the term nature, but of course you know what I'm getting at. I'm getting at ecosystems. I'm talking about coral reefs, I'm talking about wetlands, I'm talking about fisheries, coastal fisheries, freshwater fisheries, I'm talking about mangroves, and all the forests, woodlands, grasslands, because they are there, we are part of it, and we ourselves are, of course, part of nature. We are ourselves, each of us is an ecosystem interacting with other ecosystems. Two ways of thinking about the value of nature comes up. One is intrinsic value, and the other is an instrumental value. And I want to speak to the instrumental value first, and then I'll come to the intrinsic one in a minute. The instrumental value is to think of the production process for goods and services. Remember, I've already covered that. That's the general consumption I'm talking about. Are produced with at least three categories of capital assets, two of which are conventional bread and butter material in economics. One is produced capital, roads, buildings, ports, machines, furniture, and so forth. A second category consists of human capital, which include health, education, skills, and character. And of course, the Aristotelian picture was built around the notion of human capital in terms of the development of character, because it is the development of character which leads to a flourishing life. Okay? So, a third category of factor in the production of goods and services, of course, ecosystems, Mother Nature's goods and services. Two types of goods and services have been unearthed by ecologists, and I will pass them by and make it clear as to why it's been proven so hard to include nature in economics. The first, which ecologists call provisioning goods, involve food, water, timber, pharmaceuticals, fibers, and non-living material. Notice these provisioning goods, the list I've given you, when human ingenuity can be transformed into final products which at market prices gives us GDP. So provisioning goods are the immediate features of nature which we connect with because our economic measurement of GDP, production of final goods, are traceable directly to them. And so when we talk about resource scarcity, we usually think in terms of the depletion of provisioning goods. A depleted forest, an unhealthy wetland, and so forth. Now these ecosystems, the provisioning goods that I'm talking about, are of course providing us with services. And I want to now think about the second category of goods and services, when in this case it'll be services rather than goods. They're called maintenance and regulating services, and that's the ecologist's definition, which include carbon recycling, carbon mediation, nitrogen fixation, degradation of waste, breaking down of waste, an extremely important function of nature, pollination, nitrogen fixation, and so forth. There are millions of such services that are provided, and they come in a rhythmic form, like the seasons is one rhythm. Then the daily rhythms, weekly rhythms, and then there are rhythms which last for hundreds of years. For example, forest turnover, trees that are long-lasting, They don't last forever. But if you're left alone, the forest regenerates and has a cycle of its own. These rhythms and the services they produce are the backbone of the provisioning goods. Without these services, there would be no provisioning goods. So in some sense, from the economist sense, these maintenance and regulating services are the basis on which the entire economy rests, because they generate the provisioning goods, food, water, clean water, and so forth, which we then can manipulate with human capital and manufactured capital, produce final goods, which are the activities with which we started. So there is a direct link, if you like, between what we actually do, if we take nature seriously, and the Aristotelian or Socratic question. All right? Okay. So now, how do you value these ecosystems? Well, there are ways of doing it, because you look for the services and ask yourself the following question. What would we lose if that service was weakened? So take a concrete example. You have a wetland out there, and you ask yourself, what is the wetland doing for us? Remember, I'm looking at the instrumental value, what is done for us, okay? And you would say, well, one thing the wetland does is it harbors insects and birds, which are useful because they pollinate the neighboring farm, let us say. So that's one service. Another service is that it recycles carbon. And so it contributes to the carbon cycle. A third one would be that there are natural cleansing processes, that water that flows by through it gets cleaned, which if it didn't, would cost us some, because we would then have to have a filtration plant. Remember, that would be like having produced capital to substitute for natural capital for this kind of ecosystem. So you can see now immediately how one can try and estimate the value of this service that the wetland produces. And of course, wetland is a capital asset. It's a stock, and the service is a flow. So the value of that stock is going to be, if you like, the present discounted value of the flow of benefits that you're likely to get. So that's the connection between services and stocks. Okay? Now, you can see there are ways of teasing out the value. And you might say, well, why is it the case that you're not using market prices? Well, the answer is that Mother Nature has three characteristics which make it very different from produced capital and human capital. The first is that nature is mobile. She moves. She's always on the move. She's not static. A tree might be static, but the seeds travel. The wind blows, the water flows. So things that you're doing here get transmitted. The consequences can get transmitted to a distant land at a future date. And it may not be possible to track it. And certainly markets are incapable of tracking them. So the adverse consequences of your action will not be recorded in the marketplace. So your action will not be recorded as having the cost it ought to. So you don't have that advantage. And I've already given you an indication of how you try and overcome this deficiency in the case of the wetland, by looking at now what the wetland actually does. And that requires science, obviously, ecologists, and then teasing out from that the value of these services. Again, perhaps using surrogate market prices. Say, for example, that if a wetland degrades and therefore cannot clean water, then you have to have a filtration plant. But now you can cost the filtration plant, and therefore use that cost as the benefit that you are losing because you have degraded the wetland. Okay? So you can see how it's possible, by recursively working through the consequences, the value of these wetlands as instrumental value. And indeed, much of resource and environmental economics has gone that route of trying to tease out. And some of the best work that's been done has been done in South Asia, and some work in Southeast Asia are of that caliber as well, of very site-specific valuation of natural capital. I'm calling now ecosystems as natural capital to put them on a par with produced capital and human capital. Okay. A second value is the amenity value of nature. It's not the means, but a direct value that we might enjoy from it. And here there's been quite a lot of work that's been done by asking people the ways of teasing out the value that people attach to nature, irrespective of whether the nature is performing the kinds of tasks that I've just now mentioned. The question, for example, is we like visiting a beach or a state park because we enjoy the experience. And the question is, how much are you willing to pay to do that? So a large literature has formed in trying to place a value on amenities by asking through questionnaires, maybe, that's called a contingent valuation method, or how much we actually pay to enjoy that, the travel cost, for example, to go to a park, go to a state park, or some scenic beauty. Okay? These two together make for the value of nature. And the question is, what do we with this? Do we do with this artillery that we have created? And I want to end with this connection between economic measurement and human well-being. Notice that the evaluation that I've been giving you is always in terms of the well-being of the person, remember, whether it's direct or indirect. So we haven't moved away from the Socratic question. Although it might look as though in deepening it, we are far removed, we're not. We're desperately trying to seek how to fill that vacuum that he left 2,500 years ago, or 2,300 years ago or so, okay? If you have the valuation of these ecosystems somehow, before I come to that, let me just point out, I said there were three features of nature which make it very difficult. I meant the mobility. There are two others which I'd like you to reflect on. One is that much of nature's processes are silent and they are invisible. That makes them very intangible. Think of what's going on in the soils under your feet, or deep in a rainforest, or deep in the waters in the Atlantic. You don't know what's going on there. And yet, it's huge turnover of biodiversity and major services. They're part of the entire rhythm of the Earth system. So what do we do with having tried hard to estimate the value of these maintenance and regulating services, and therefore the provisional goods that I mentioned? Well, what you want to do is to put them on a par with produced capital and natural capital. And human capital, both of which are missing in GDP. And the reason is that the GDP is a flow and it's gross domestic product, which means it doesn't include the depreciation of capital that might go in this production. And of course, the kind of depreciation I have in mind in today's world, where we are eating into nature, is the depreciation of natural capital. Okay? So the thing is, now we have to move away from GDP, which has nothing to do with human well-being, except insofar it gives you current consumption. It doesn't have any place in it about future consumption. So if you have a view of life, which includes your children, your grandchildren, and so forth, you really have to move away from flows like GDP to stocks. And so here is the fundamental theorem, which will wrap up the whole thing. One can prove, and it's a mathematical theorem, very easy to prove, that if you have a conception of well-being across the generations, say because you're a utilitarian and you're adding up the life satisfactions of people, not just today, but the expected life satisfaction of children, grandchildren, and so forth. Suppose that's your criterion. And in fact, that's the one which most economists use, because the utilitarianism has a very clean way of thinking about well-being. You're adding the well-beings, not multiplying them and so forth. Okay, so it's a mathematical ease. But the theorem doesn't depend on that. You give me a conception of intergenerational well-being, and there corresponds a set of prices of these three categories of goods that I mentioned: produced capital, human capital, and natural capital, such that if you add the values with these prices, of the totality of your stocks of produced capital, natural capital, and human capital, and call that wealth, then wealth and intergenerational well-being move in the same way. If one increases over time, the other increases over time. If one declines over time, the other declines over time. It's an equivalence result. It doesn't tell you what you should do, but it does tell you that instead of looking at intergenerational well-being, you may as well look at wealth, because you will be able to measure, in principle, you can measure the stocks of the assets, including ecosystems and their health, and then tease out the prices that you might want to use, you ought to be using in order to estimate the wealth. And I've already told you the methods by which you try and estimate these prices for natural capital. For the other forms of capital, very often you might be willing to use market prices, because after all, if you're trading at that price, you must be willing to pay for the good at the price that you're paying. So therefore, it does reflect something like at the margin, your notion of its value to you of the commodity. The real problem, the sweat, arises over natural capital because market prices are missing. You have to really do some work. And that's what I tried to give you an indication of how that work happens. So we now have a complete story of how to think about wealth and well-being, which is that we ought to be thinking about wealth, not GDP. And it should be an inclusive notion of wealth, which includes natural capital in an essential kind of way. And in some sense, that's the one which is going to cause most of our needs, most of our work, because the prices are not there. You really need to have ecologists working with sociologists and economists, obviously, in tandem. And they have to be very site-specific. And that's what makes me, as a teacher, very excited, because wonderful work can be done in the poorest of countries in estimating the worth of these natural assets, which are very site-specific, and that could be helping in their own development paths. Remember, ecosystems are not the same everywhere. A lake in Tanzania is different from a lake in Canada. The entire ecosystem is very different. So the valuation has to be very site-specific. That means more work, but it's also most enjoyable work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, for sharing your thoughts with us.